Hello, everyone. I want to thank you for participating in this, our inaugural presentation in our Reimagining the Latinx Experience in America book talk series. This is the first of several for the year, and I just wanted to alert you to the two upcoming presentations in the series this semester. They all take place at noon Pacific time. And a week from today, Maria Rendon will be talking about her book, Stagnant Dreamers, with commentary by Professor Edward Thayes. And then on Monday, October 12th at 12 noon Pacific, Laura Enriquez will be talking about her book, Of Love and Paper. So we hope you will join us for those as well. Now, events like this never happen without a lot of help. So before we get to the main event with Professor Laura Gómez, who'll be talking about her book, Inventing Latinos, I wanted to acknowledge a few folks who made this event possible. One of them, of course, is my wonderful research assistant, Isabela Ordorica, who is a rising 2L here at UC Irvine School of Law. She was also recently accepted onto the Law Review here at UCI. And I also wanted to mention that for question and answer, we'll be taking those in the chat function, and Isabela will be monitoring the chat and posing questions from the audience. We may not be able to get to all the questions, but we will try to get to as many as we can. So in that spirit, I also wanted to acknowledge Jillian Henry, Robbie Kadri, Aaron Hebert, Angie Middleton, Anna Iliff, and Colleen Tarakani, members of the dedicated staff, very talented people working here at UCI Law, and of course, last but not least, to Dean Song Richardson and the UCI School of Law for their support of this series. And now to what we've all been waiting for. Professor Laura Gómez is going to be talking about her book on Inventing Latinos, a new story of American racism. I have it here. And I hope that you will enjoy this. I think it's going to be a wonderful presentation. I've had the opportunity to discuss this with Laura and also to hear a presentation about a chapter in the book, and I think you're going to find it very stimulating. Now, Laura is Professor of Law and Faculty Director of UCLA Law's Critical Race Studies program, which is the first specialized program of study on race and law for law students in the nation. And in 2000, she founded the program, and she became the second Latina tenured at a top 20 US law school. She holds joint appointments in UCLA's Sociology Department and the Department of Chicana and Chicano Studies and Central American Studies. Her scholarship focuses on the intersection of law, race, politics, and inequality, both historically and today. And I think you're going to get a flavor of that research in today's book talk. So now I want to turn it over with great appreciation to you, Professor Laura Gómez. Thank you so much for being a part of our inaugural book talk.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction. And I'm just delighted to kick off this Reimagining the Latinx Experience book talk series, which is, of course, a product of UC Irvine School of Law, but also the American Bar Foundation's Future of Latinos project. And I do want to take just a couple of minutes to acknowledge a few people. I start with you, Rachel. You have been a trailblazer in so many ways, but including because you were the first Latina ever tenured at a top 10 law school, and for many years the only one in that category. You have been my friend, mentor, and colleague. I first met you when I was a Stanford Law student. And it's lovely to be able to join you today. And I just wanted to say that you have two very direct connections, if not more, to this book. One is when you were dean, you gave out summer funding over too many summers probably for me to finish this book, but at last it is here. And then also, I don't know how much you remember about this, but you gave me some really insightful feedback on the book proposal, which really helped get me going and generate my enthusiasm, and I think the enthusiasm of the new press for the book. So I thank you for all of that. And then Isabella, thank you for your work. I've tried and failed to recruit you to UCLA to our CRS program, but it sounds like you're thriving there. I am always delighted to speak at UC Irvine. It seems to happen about once a year. And it's always wonderful to, you know, in some ways, I guess the silver lining is that even more people from all over the place can join us today, including my parents who are watching from Albuquerque. Last time I spoke at UC Irvine, it was at the invitation of the Department of Criminology, Law, and Society, and it was May 2019. And this came at a crucial time in this book's gestation. And I just want to say thank you to the CLS audience, and especially to Carol Saran and Val Jenes for their supporting and supportively critical feedback at that time. So when talking about a book, one always faces the dilemma of how to cover such a large topic, right? And most authors will take the approach of focusing on one chapter, but I'm going to try something a little bit different today. I want to give you a sense of the full scope of the book, and so I will spend around 5 minutes introducing you to each of the 4 chapters in the book. And my hope is that this whirlwind tour gives you an overview, and then we can go deeper in the question and answer period. And I also believe it's a fitting way to begin this book series on the Latinx experience, going for breadth rather than depth at this point. So the first chapter is called We Are Here Because You Were There. And this is a critical survey of the long history of US empire in North and South America. And due to that American imperialism, Latino immigrants, and especially those from Central America, Mexico, and the Spanish Caribbean, should be considered involuntary migrants and treated accordingly under the law, treated as political refugees. That is the argument that I end up making. I want to focus, since we have just a little bit to give you a flavor of this chapter, I want to focus on Central Americans, who are combined 9% of all Latinos in the US. The intensity and cumulative nature of US imperialism in Central America is staggering. It's staggering in time, starting with 1916, when the Marines occupied Nicaragua for 20 years. They continued to interfere in Nicaragua in 1936, when they installed Somoza as dictator, allowing him and his sons to control the country for 4 decades. And it continued up until 1990, when President Reagan ordered 20,000 troops to Nicaragua, along with a covert operation to support the anti-Sandinista Contras. One of the chief strategies in Central America has been to train the nation's militaries and national police forces, who often turn their weapons on their citizenry. More than 60,000 Latin American military officers were trained by American military at the School of the Americas over 6 decades, from 1940 to 2000. And the kinds of brutalities that they committed with training by the US military and weapons by the US, sold to them by the US military, is staggering. So in the 1970s, Somoza slaughtered 50,000 people out of a population of 3.5 million. That would be equivalent to 5 million deaths in the US today, something that we're now unfortunately used to thinking about because of the 200,000 COVID deaths that we're facing. But imagine 5 million. In the 1980s, the US funded Contras killed another 30,000 in Nicaragua. In El Salvador, there wasn't intervention until 1961 because a small group of elite families controlled the farmlands, and so there wasn't room for the Americans to maneuver on that ground. But there was a fear in the 60s that El Salvador would become another Cuba. And so the US supported a right-wing candidate there, eventually providing in the 1980s $6 billion in military funding. And within 3 years, in the early 1980s, the military, the Salvadoran military grew from 15,000 troops to 52,000 troops. And they murdered in the 80s 75,000, mostly indigenous Salvadorans. There's a similar pattern in Guatemala. American imperialism there began differently because there was not widespread land ownership by people. It began with the United Fruit Company, which was one of the strongest multinationals at the time. And suffice it to say that the United Fruit Company was so intertwined with the US government that its lawyers and board members moved back and forth between the corporation and the cabinet. And after a leftist rose to power in the 1940s, the US staged its first coup there, setting off a 35-year civil war, during which School of America's trained military officers murdered 200,000 civilians. More than 80% of the dead were Maya. So these are the kinds of dynamics that I assert should lead us to see migrants from Central America and actually other parts of the Latin America as well as involuntary migrants who deserve refuge here rather than the kind of treatment that they have received under several presidencies, but most dramatically under President Trump. I want to just close by reading one little segment from the book. Today, and for the past several decades, America has reaped what it has sowed. We should not be surprised that the results have been the migration north of people escaping poverty and state violence. It should also surprise no one that where Latinos fit in the American racial hierarchy has been overdetermined by at least 125 years of Latino migrants, an easily available, expendable, low-wage workforce for American factories, farms, and corporations. Okay, so I want to go on now to chapter 2, Idealized Mestizaje and Anti-Black and Anti-Indian Racism. And the focus here is going to be the Spanish Caribbean, who combined are 17% of the Latino population. Puerto Ricans are 10%, Cuban Americans are 4%, and Dominicans are 3%. My analysis in this chapter puts into sharp relief the legacy of an even earlier colonialism in the Americas, that by Spain. 80 million indigenous people were in the Americas at the time of the Spanish contact, and only 10 million survived. 12 million African slaves were forcibly taken from Africa and imported to the Americas, and this is probably an underestimate. Results of a complicated system of white supremacy included the fact that intermarriage was not banned. Was penalized in some ways, but it was not banned. And so we see today in our faces and in our families, we see that diversity, that mestizaje from those three groups, those three roots. We also see colorism, a preference for lighter skin tone. And we see anti-Black and anti-Indian racism among Latinos today. And so we have the effects of white supremacy under Spanish colonialism, the effects of a white supremacy under the independent governments after Spanish rule, and then we see those refracted in terms of US colonialism and then migration to the United States, right? So I'm trying to kind of get into how those are all woven together and create particular racial dynamics that are unique to Latinos in the US today. So one upshot is that Caribbean Latinos in the US underestimate their African ancestry to a degree that is confusing for others who may principally see them as Black. So consider that the 2000 census allowed us to self-identify with 2 or more races, right? So you could imagine a situation where Dominican Latinos say that they are white and Black, right, as well as Latino. But what has happened is that only 8% of Dominicans in the US say that they are Black in terms of census racial categories. A large chunk of them say that they are other, right? A very large chunk of them. Similarly, Puerto Ricans say that 6% of Puerto Ricans say that they are Black. But many see this as an underestimate that is driven by internalized racism, as well as the racism that they encounter. And some evidence of this is the fact that you see Dominicans in New York and New Jersey identifying as white, much less so than those in Florida identify. So in Florida, 2 times as many Dominicans choose racial white, what I call census white. And I hypothesize that this is in response to very intense anti-Black racism that they experience in Florida, after all, a part of the South. And it's actually similar for Mexican Americans, comparing those in California with those in Texas. So if you will just forgive me for not going into too much detail, but on the census, which we've recently filled out, there's a Hispanic ethnicity question, and then there's a race question. Well, this very large segment, about 40% for all of the censuses since 1980, chooses other. That's Latinos overall. But if you look at California compared to Texas Mexicans, 53% of California Mexican Americans choose other compared to 36% of Texas Mexican Americans. And again, I think that there is evidence that suggests, and I conclude, that there is the part of the response to racism is wanting to identify as white and wanting to distance oneself from indigenous identity and from African ancestry. And this chapter brings us up to the present time, and a time where we're beginning to see more pride in Afro-Latinidad, in Indo-Latinidad in the United States in a sustained way. And, but we still have this legacy, and it's not going to go away quickly. Okay, so turning to chapter 3, entitled "The Elusive Quest for Whiteness," a good segue from what we were just discussing. So this, in my review of this chapter, I'll focus on Mexican Americans. In each chapter, I focus on Latinos of all subgroups, but I'm going to focus on Mexican Americans for this part of the story. Almost 70% of Latinos are of Mexican origin. And note that this is a little higher than some estimates that you may see. And that is because I'm including in this group those who say that they are other Spanish, other Hispanic, most of whom are from New Mexico. And so again, for reasons that I detail in the book, I hypothesize that those are from the very early Mexican Americans, those who were here at the time that the Mexican cession was granted to the US. Okay, so 8 out of 10 Mexican Americans are citizens. And this is a much higher number than all subgroups except Cuban Americans, who came as refugees and therefore received all the benefits that entailed, and Puerto Ricans, of course, who are not immigrants at all. Mexican Americans in the early 20th century emerged as a buffer group between whites above them and blacks below them. And I just want to talk a little bit about some of the sort of larger kind of macro historical trends that shaped this reality. First, there was the formation of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the Mexican Cession, which I just referenced in 1848. At the time, only whites could become naturalized citizens. And yet, in order to obtain the Mexican legislature's assent to the treaty, they had to guarantee the Mexicans living in the vast Mexican Cession American citizenship. So there was a way in which this was, and my earlier work on this goes into it in much more detail in Manifest Destinies, that this was a kind of a quasi-whiteness that Mexicans were obtaining at the very beginning. But that was soon to be disrupted in a couple of ways. One is a 1907 case that many of you will be familiar with, called In re Rodriguez from San Antonio, Texas. The San Antonio context was one in which white elites were split in an eerie similarity to what we see today. On the one side, there were too many Mexican American voters for many people's liking, right? So these were Mexican American citizens, and that was definitely rankling some white elites. On the other hand, there were agricultural businesses, farmers, who needed Mexican laborers and who wanted to increase the flow of the Mexican population. The mestizaje that I was talking about earlier came back to haunt Mr. Rodriguez. Was he white or was he indigenous? Or was he black, right? Because after the Civil War, the naturalization laws were changed, and so you could be white or black. But if he was indigenous, then it wasn't clear that he could naturalize. In his own testimony, his own words, he said, quote, that he was a pure-blooded Mexican, which of course is full of ironies given the mestizaje, right? But the judge commented on how dark-skinned he was and how Indian-looking he was. An expert witness anthropologist who was called to testify said that he would not classify Rodriguez as white, but he also is certain he's not an African or a person of African descent. Ultimately, the judge relied on his common sense. He doesn't seem white, but so many other Mexicans have been naturalized that I'm going to allow this. And so this seems like a victory. It was certainly a victory for Mr. Rodriguez, but in a sense it was somewhat short-lived, because just 10 years later, the US passed its first temporary agricultural workers law, right? A guest worker program. And we've had one ever since. And the message here is, you're good enough to work here, but not to stay here. Just a little bit more on this kind of context. So 1924, then we go another 7 years, and we're passing, the US is passing a naturalization law that is designed to make the US look like the US looked in 1890, racially and ethnically, before the massive influx of Southern and Eastern Europeans. Immigrants. By this time, immigrant workers from Asia have also already been banned, and now this 1924 law made it certain that those lower stock European immigrants weren't going to be allowed in, but neither were Latin American immigrants going to be allowed. And so that law was in force until 1965, and it's 1965 when we see the really astounding growth of Latin American and Asian immigration. So in this climate of the 1920s and the Rodriguez case and so forth, an early organization like LULAC, which was founded in 1921 in Corpus Christi, made a choice to emphasize their Americanness, right? It was a League of United Latin American Citizens, and to adopt an assimilationist ideology. And this ideology included what some have called the other white legal strategy, right? We are going to fight against discrimination, but we're not going to say that we're not white in being discriminated against. And so it kind of put things in a precarious, in terms of a legal standpoint, in a precarious position. And I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. In reality, I think a large part of what was happening in that era, in not only in Texas, but throughout the Southwest, was that Mexicans were saying, we aren't Black, so don't treat us like Blacks, right? And so it was this kind of defensive whiteness that they were claiming. This began to break down, this ideology of assimilation and the other white legal strategy began to break down after World War II, because so many Mexican American servicemen were coming back and facing intense discrimination from the fact that their families weren't allowed to bury them in certain places, to outright violence, even when they were wearing their uniforms, to not being served in restaurants. But it doesn't totally break down until the 1960s and the 1970s in a series of school desegregation cases that we could talk about further in the Q&A if you'd like. I want to take about 5 more minutes, and does that sound okay? Okay, so I'm gonna take about 5 more minutes and talk about chapter 4, and then I will look forward to receiving your questions. So chapter 4, To Count, We Must Be Counted, is about the census and the decision in 1980 to add the first ever nationwide count of Latinos, the so-called Hispanic ethnicity question, which remains unchanged today despite a intensive study and recommendation to eliminate the Hispanic ethnicity question for 2020 and instead incorporate Latinos as a racial option under the race question. As you know, the Trump administration did not adopt that policy. So in this section, I want to focus a little bit more on Cubans and Puerto Ricans. I chose Cubans because they played such a critical role in both pushing the census vis-a-vis the Hispanic Advisory Committee to use the Hispanic ethnicity question rather than a racial option, but also because they took advantage of the data from 1980 to dominate advertising, in particular Spanish language advertising, and also in the political realm. And we see that even today, right? If we look at the US Senate, there are 4 senators of Latino origin, and 3 of the 4 are Cuban Americans, despite them only being 4% of the Latino population. I also want to bring Puerto Rico back into this conversation, and I just want to emphasize that they have been in a colonial status for 122 years. They have the freedom to migrate to the mainland as American citizens, but their freedom is curtailed and as individuals on the island, and their self-determination is curtailed. In terms of individuals, of course, they don't have the right to vote for president. They don't have voting representatives in Congress. At the state level, or at the group level, they don't have self-determination as a nation or as a U.S. state. And this was on display vividly recently with the bankruptcy matters and the dire financial consequences or financial situation, which has resulted in the federal government setting up Promesa, a committee of federal government appointed non-Puerto Ricans who determines the fiscal policy of Puerto Rico. And whereas if they'd been a state, they would have had the authority to file for bankruptcy and to claim protections under that provision. So going back to the 1980 Hispanic ethnicity question, although Cubans played a central role in the in leading up to the question, it was really Mexican Americans who turned the corner. Because after the 1970 results came out, they sued the federal government, claiming an undercount of Mexican Americans. The lawsuit was ultimately unsuccessful in terms of its legal status, but it was successful in terms of its political status, right? It pushed the census to reevaluate the question of how Latinos would be counted and could be counted nationwide. And, you know, we haven't looked back since then, right? So keep in mind that at the time, we were looking at Hispanic ethnicity in terms of, do you speak Spanish at home? Or were you born, what country were you born in? And what country were your parents born in? Those kinds of questions, right? And you can see how those would underestimate the population. I want to kind of wrap up here by talking about the census and political power, and the fact that although Latinos are 20% of the US population today, 60 million people, they are only 11% of the national electorate. Mostly that's because they are too young to vote. 1/3 of all Latinos are under age 18. But keep this in mind. With each election, we are seeing the impact of Latinos aging into voting, right? So for example, between the 2016 presidential election and the 2018 midterm elections, 4 million additional Latinos million additional Latinos voted, the vast majority of whom were voters who turned 18 between 2016 and 2018. And that's really astounding. And of course, we see this playing out today in terms of different states and the electorates that they have. And I just want to nod to this, and then again, we could come back to this. But thinking about New York and New Jersey, where Latinos who are Puerto Rican and Dominican predominate, they will be 15% of the 2020 electorate. In Florida, Latinos will be 20%. And keep in mind that Florida is no longer just talking about Cuban Americans. In fact, Cubans are outnumbered by all other Latinos combined in Florida. And of course, we see Texas and California, which are not only delegate-rich states, or I guess we should be saying electoral college delegates states, they are 30%. Latinos are 30% of the electorate in those states. I think I will just close by saying that what I have tried to do in this book is provide a deeply historicized, contextualized account of where Latinos are today, and in particular, the ways in which Latinos have been racialized, how that racialization is similar to that African Americans have experienced, but also different and important ways. And I hope that we can continue to have a great conversation during the Q&A. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Gómez. Fantastic talk. We've gotten lots of compliments on it on the chat function. Isabella, did you want to start asking the audience questions now? And also to remind you, if you have questions, please post them on the chat function.
Yes, I can go ahead and start posing questions to Professor Gómez. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. Our first question from one of our attendees asked, was there anything similar to the Chinese Exclusion Act for Latinos?
That's a really good question. Of course, the Chinese Exclusion Act was enacted in 1882. There wasn't anything outright like that, singling out any particular group of Latinos. What there was is the combination of things that we were talking about, the 1924 legislation, right, which really put a damper, but it wasn't quite in the same way. And I would submit that why it wasn't because there wasn't racial animus against Latinos. It was because there was this tension because of the need for Mexican and other Latino workers, and in particular for workers who were vulnerable and low wage. So you see a very different pattern than with respect to Asians, probably related to proximity, right?
I'm not currently seeing any other questions in the chat. Okay, I just got one. So our next question is, despite being such a small percentage of the Latino population, why are Cubans overwhelmingly involved in American politics at the federal level?
Sorry, I'm
Gómez?
muted. That is a really good question. Thank you for that. So there are a couple of different theories. One that I think is particularly compelling is that Cuban Americans, as I said, they came to this country as refugees. Well, that's not entirely true. There were some who came earlier in the 20th century. And in fact, Bob Menendez, senator from New Jersey, his parents, he was born in New York, and his parents migrated to the US in, I believe, the 40s, right? So there was a small trickle of immigrants before 1959 and the Socialist Revolution, but the bulk came after that, and they came in with resources. If you're a refugee in the US, you receive health benefits, you receive welfare benefits and housing benefits and job benefits and privileges. And so they were differently situated from the standpoint of other immigrants, right? But also they came with large amounts of capital. Now that doesn't, and I mean actual economic capital, that doesn't mean that all of them came with that, right? I'm not saying that, but you had, I believe it's 10% of Cuba's population left in the 1960s. And that was disproportionately very affluent, well-off Cubans, right? And it was bankers, and it was business owners, and it was professors and well-educated people. And so you have a population that, even though they just came in the 60s, they came with a profile that is different from every other Latino subgroup, right? So I think that's an important factor. And then I'll say one more thing, which is that Cuban Americans, because they were concentrated in not only one state, but one regional area, right? Miami-Dade County, right? Southern Florida, they were able to amass a kind of political influence coupled with economic influence in that region that then they were able to parlay to the national stage. So that is part of the analysis, I think, that I would offer. And Isabella, if you want, I can actually, well, no, you keep reading them and yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Okay, whatever is easier. Our next question is, I'm curious if you can say a few words about the relationship between Dominicans and Haitians. Anti-Blackness is a global phenomenon, and the US continuously exports negative racial attitudes. Moreover, unlike Cubans, who were able to receive refugee status, Haitians were not. How would you evaluate the role of the US empire in creating and fueling racial tensions on La Hispaniola?
Yes, thank you for that question. Okay, so it's rich in so many ways. So the Dominican Republic and Haiti share an island. The United States invaded both of them. It stayed in the Dominican Republic in the early 20th century for 20 years, and I believe in Haiti for 30 years, or maybe I got those reversed, and but a long chunk of time. And it is certainly true that there is, you know, the two, one was a French colony, one was a Spanish colony. I think mythology, I'm going to use that word, and you know, I realize that it's loaded, but I'm going to use that word. The mythology was that Haitians were Black and Dominicans were Spanish. The truth is that there was incredible racial mixture in both populations. And in fact, you know, when you sort of look at a hierarchy in the Caribbean, based on race, oftentimes the lowest wage workers were the Haitians who were trying to migrate to the Dominican Republic, but the Dominican Republic low wage workers were trying to migrate to Puerto Rico, and the Puerto Ricans were migrating to the US, right? And so you had kind of a hierarchy in terms of wealth and educational attainment, but also in terms of skin color and ancestry. And, you know, one of the really fascinating things that I write about in the book is that in the Dominican Republic, the anti-Blackness was so strong that it translated into Dominicans, and I'm talking about Dominicans in the Dominican Republic, although obviously there's some connection to those who come to the United States. The Dominicans in the Dominican Republic developed this idea of themselves as indios. And it's very different. And as the wonderful Dominican sociologist, Janetta Candelario has written in her book, she says that the irony of this is that there are no Indians in the Dominican Republic. They were wiped out at contact. And yet, you know, we claim this identity, right? She says other Latin American countries, they've got indigenous populations, right? And, you know, obviously there's a lot of complexities there that I get into as well. But this is a fascinating, I think, example of the questioner's point that Dominicans think that they are racially better than the Haitians. You know, I think to the extent that your question is about, yeah, I mean, I think that the US was instrumental in kind of responding to that hierarchy in the early 20th century, the fact that they perceive themselves as better than Dominicans, and using that as leverage, you know, between the two countries, you know, to divide and conquer in between the two countries. But I guess what I would say is it's certainly not only the US because of that internalized anti-African, deeply rooted anti-African racism that's there.
Our next question in the chat is, how should Latinos approach changing this colorism pasted down by generations to unite the current generations and to educate the older and younger ones to come?
Okay, that is a really good question too. I think that, you know, it's interesting because I'm going to reference here a book by a colleague of mine, Osagi Obasagi, who wrote a book several years ago about how blind people how blind people learn to understand and become racist. And, you know, he was interested in this irony of like, well, blind people can't see, so how do they learn, you know, maybe they're not racist because they can't see. And in fact, they are as racist as their family members, their white family members, it turns out. These are people who are blind from birth, by the way, because they are taught as children to be so, right? So I would say that the best way for us to combat colorism is to do that at an early age. And we have seen some of this, you know, I don't want to say that there has never been I think there has always been even as there has been a white is better kind of preference, there's also been an appreciation for those with darker skin, and you hear that in a lot of songs and stuff, and you could think about that, and you could talk about whether or not that's empowering or disempowering. But I do think that since the Chicano movement, that there has been much more of a pride and kind of brown is beautiful. You know, your indigenous or mestizaje is valued. But really I think we still too often we try to make ourselves look more European, say by dyeing our hair shades of red. Or we try to, we try to promote lighter skin in terms of choosing our children, choosing people to date and mate, or even in keeping our kids out of the sun, or keeping our kid, right? There's just some of that. And, I was saying in another context that, Latinos will always ask when a baby's born, one of the first questions will be, well, how light or dark is the baby, right? And of course you can't exactly tell a baby how, you can't see from infancy necessarily, but people are really interested in that. And so I think the way that we start to change is by changing at home and in the family.
We have several more questions that are really great, so I want to try to ask them as quickly as I can. The next one is, what do you see as the primary obstacle keeping Puerto Rico from achieving full statehood, since the majority of its population favors it? What would you have to change in Washington to make statehood, along with 2 additional reliably Democratic Senate seats, a reality?
Well, that's an easy one to answer. What would have to change is Democrats controlling all 3, both houses of Congress and the White House. Why don't I just jump to the next one, and just to save time, is that okay, Isabella? So the next question is, what is the status, and I know you can't see these, audience, so I'm going to read them to you as Isabella had been doing. What is the status of Spanish being equal to English as the official state language, the official language? That is actually a pretty long conversation that goes back. There hasn't been as much focus on that. There was a strong English only, English as official language movement, in particular in the 80s and 90s. It's kind of a little less virulent right now. I think that where it's strongest right now is the southern and Midwestern states, where Latinos are a growing population, but a relatively recent population, especially since 2000. So the next question, let's see. As a Latina, I think I will skip the one about law school, but if you want to email me, you can email me and I will answer that, okay? Okay, so, and let's see, I'm just looking at the time, but I can't find the time. Okay, is there a benefit one way or another if Latinx is listed as a race or ethnic group on the census? And I think I'm going to take that question because it's really at the core of a lot of what I'm hoping to do in this book. So my argument, and it's not one that, you know, by any means that everyone agrees with, and I acknowledge those who disagree with me, and you know, as they say, some of my best friends disagree with me on this, but I feel strongly about it, that the fact that you have 40% of Latinos saying that they are other race, not white, rejecting saying they're white, rejecting saying they're Black, rejecting saying they're American Indian, rejecting saying they're Asian, and not saying multiple of those categories, right? Because that's allowed since 2000 on the census. But 40% of them saying that they're other it should shock us, and it should lead us to say there's something wrong with the question. The question is not accurately capturing the lived reality of those Latinos. And so the Obama, after the 2010 census, and it, you know, this had been happening for decades, but finally after the 2010 census officials implemented a very rigorous testing process to find out what would happen if we removed the Hispanic ethnicity question and added Latino as a race category. Now keep in mind, that would mean that people could still check white and Latino, or Black and Latino, right? Like, so that the multiple categories was still going to be popular, but would that solve the problem? Would we get rid of this huge other population? And they rigorously tested this. They did written surveys, and they did mail-in surveys, and they did surveys with Latinos of different groups, like those who are more Afro-descended from the Spanish Caribbean subgroups, Mexican Americans, etc. So they really did this comprehensive study, and they said it doesn't hurt any data collection. It doesn't reduce the number of the accuracy, and it substantially improves the accuracy, because those 40% of Latinos who were saying that they are other chose this Latino category, as well as did many of those who said that they were white on the census, right? So interestingly, it didn't result that a lot of people were saying Latino and something else. People were just saying Latino. So coupled with other data that we have, to me, this shows that where we've come to now, 40 years after the Hispanic ethnicity question was added, is that Latinos think of themselves in racial terms. And that may well be because others think of us in racial terms. I wrote an op-ed last week in a national publication, and I got a number of hate mail emails. And one of the emails said, "Go back to Honduras." That was the subject line. You know, and it's part of this kind of idea that others do not know how to categorize us, that others lump us together. And then sometimes we want to do that as well. We want to make alliances as well. And so that is my, now let me just wrap this up by saying this. So the Trump administration did two things last spring. Number one, they said, despite the fact that all of the career civil servants at the census are telling us this is the right thing to do to get a more accurate count of the population, we're going to say no to that proposal. We're going to keep the Hispanic ethnicity question format. And number two, a month later, they said, oh, and by the way, we're going to add a question on citizenship to the 2020 census. And that was ultimately stopped by the Supreme Court, right? In a decision in which Chief Justice John Roberts said that he found the administration's explanation that this was to improve voting rights, to improve the Enforcement of the Voting Rights Act, to be incredulous, right? So I guess to me that is, that is the kind, and then we see what's happened since then with Trump saying just a couple of weeks ago that he was going to exclude undocumented persons from the census, when that's impossible because he doesn't know who's undocumented. And, he cannot present the census to Congress with anyone excluded, right? So it's a continuing, I think all of these things are linked together in a deeply racist, anti-Latino effort. And, where that leaves us is interesting. I think it will, undoubtedly depend on what this presidential election is. But either way, no matter who's elected, the 2020 census is going to show that the second largest racial group in the United States is other. So, be on time.
We are at 12:55, so we have a few minutes left.
Okay, I can take one.
Make any, take another question.
I'll take another question, yeah.
There was one that was about the comparative economic mobility of Asian immigrant groups and Latinos.
Yes.
From Cassandra Flores at 12:40 p.m.
Can you read that one to me, because I can't find it offhand?
Okay, shall I go ahead, Isabella, and read it, or do you want to do it?
I can go ahead and take it.
Okay,
Thank you.
great.
So it says, on the topic with refugees, is this also why the economic mobility of some Asian immigrant groups has been faster than immigrants from Latino countries that do not come as refugees?
Sure. Yeah, that's a really good question. So in terms of the Asian groups that are refugees, that would be the Vietnamese and Hmong and Cambodian groups. And those coincidentally are not groups that have shown, well, I think there's a mixed record in terms of the economic mobility that those groups have experienced. Certainly, it's better than, I would say, well, it's tricky. Filipinos are a good comparison because they also have come to the US with relatively, until recently, lower levels of education, and didn't come with refugee status. So I think it's a very different, what I would say is this, it's a very different trajectory than Cuban Americans, right? And even if we were, as I suggest doing, to give refugee status to, for example, all Central American immigrants in light of the long and very recent US imperialism in the region, those are oftentimes, the Central American immigrants are the most disadvantaged. And so it is not going to overnight lead to economic success at an aggregate level for those groups. Although I think it would improve the story. And I think that that's very similar to where we are with the Southeast Asian groups who received refugee status.
Well, great. We had a request for a link to your op-ed. So I don't know if you could just let us know where it appeared so that we could at least give that information.
Yeah, I don't think I can, I'm not quick enough to
but
put
maybe
it in
if you
there,
just tell us the outlet.
It's in NBCnews.com.
Great.
On Friday.
Wonderful. So first of all, we wanted to thank you for this wonderful presentation and all the terrific questions from the audience. We appreciate everyone who joined us today. And we hope also that you'll join us for our next book talk with Professor Maria Rendon on Stagnant Dreamers, How the Inner City Shapes the Integration of Second Generation Latinos. And that we'll also have commentary from Professor Edward Thayes. So I think it's going to promise to be a really great event. And by the way, my fabulous research assistant, Isabella, has already found the link for us. So thank you so much. And we are grateful to all of you and wish you well. And especially we're grateful to Professor Gómez for launching this series in such a spectacular way. So We appreciate it. It's hard to applaud on Zoom, but we are all applauding, and many people in the chat singled out just how much they enjoyed it. This was recorded, and Isabella, how can people get a copy or see the recording if they want to watch it again, as some people said they did? Do you know?
So I don't know for sure, but I believe that we are able to send an email to all of the attendees today with the link to the recording.
Great.
It's probably my mother who wants to see it again.
Oh, she must be using a pseudonym because they were other names. So anyway, thanks so much. We're going to end on time. And again, we hope to see you at future book talks and appreciate your interest in the series. And thank you to all who made it possible again.